Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 27th of November and I apologize for the 9-day hiatus. I was visiting Poland, but now I'm back. And we're going to look through so many updates, many of which we've been talking about for so many weeks and months. And now a lot of those projections have started to manifest into reality. So that includes in the area around Hulyaipole, in Novopavlivka, in Pokrovsk and Vuhledar, around Siversk, Lyman, etc., etc. So let's zoom in. We're going to go through everything. I'm not going to do it in an extremely detailed manner because that would take forever. And instead, we're going to do a really glossary sort of summary of everything going from Huliapole all the way up to the Vovchansk front. Let's zoom in over here on what's going on to the east of Huliapole, and I'll turn on the trench map so you guys get a reference point and are able to see where the Russians have been able to overrun Ukrainian defenses. As you guys can see, there are two polygons over here that I have marked, and these indicate advances over the past 9 days. So the Russian forces have been able to take over Zeleny High and Vysoké, and this has been confirmed as of the past few days, and so this is a relatively new development. These are areas where the situation along the front line is a bit more fluid than what is normally to be expected, and that's because more generally in the region between the Yancho River line and then the High River line, which is where you have Huliapole and all the villages located to the north, there is a lot of fluidity. There's a lot of open areas, in the villages that are present over here are small in terms of surface area. There aren't many basements or otherwise structures that can be used for infantry to actually build up a base of operations. And so then everything in the hinterlands, all these various fields and tree lines in between, they turn into gray zones, and there is a bit of back and forth. You also still have pockets of very small, minimal Ukrainian resistance that doesn't get cleared because either those Ukrainian forces are able to hold out or they're not even spotted. And so it's sometimes inaccurate to paint with a very broad brush and say that the entirety of the fields and all of the tree lines over here are taken over by the Russians. And so that's why for a while over these past 9 days, it wouldn't have really been accurate to say that all of these locations in yellow have been taken over by the Russians in one fell swoop. But gradually, day after day, these areas have been consolidated upon and have been taken over, and by extension, so have the villages that are located around these fields. So that would include Zeleny High and Vysoké. So the Russian forces at their zenith were able to push 5.9 kilometers westwards and capture about 23.6 square kilometers within this zone of the front line, and then another 39.2 square kilometers of territory directly northeast of Huliapole. And in this particular location, you're looking at an advance, and we're going to measure it here diagonally southwestwards. It's about a 7.5 kilometer advance, and so that's even more substantial in terms of the distance traveled. Again, you're looking at large swaths of open fields, areas that simply were untenable for the Ukrainians to retain control over following the collapse of Vysoké, because by that point, you had, from a Ukrainian standpoint, no more anchors the infantry on the ground can use to drag out the fighting. So they had to withdraw to the Tika, but even then, the Russian forces were able to very quickly infiltrate into that village, and because it's really based around a single road, the Russian forces were just able to permeate from the southeastern outskirts all the way up to the northwest in a relatively fast fashion. So Zatisha, the fall of that village precipitated the collapse of everything nearby, including some of the trench networks located to its north, all of the fields to the northwest or to the northeast, and it also opened up a pathway for Russian soldiers to enter into the eastern outskirts of Huliapole. Now, I'm well aware, so don't get me wrong, I've read all the reports and I've seen the maps from Russian sources indicating the southeastern portion of Huliapole, perhaps around Velika Street, near areas where the Haicha River starts to connect to Marfapil, that region. There are claims by Russian sources that this location has fallen into Russian hands, that there is a presence of Russian forces in this location following a Ukrainian withdrawal. I'm aware, and this has been the case for a couple of days now, that this has been circulating through Russian news sources, but since then we've not received any sort of reporting or corroboration from the Ukrainian end, and we've not seen footage yet. And so it could be true, but I'm not going to mark any sort of changes definitively, because even as we're speaking, there's still no confirmation of the Russians fully consolidating control over all of the fields located to the east of Huliapole, to the east of the trench network protecting Huliapole, or to the east of the Haicha River. And so until that's settled, we can't really jump to any other conclusions about deeper Russian infiltrations, but certainly keep an eye out for it because the Ukrainian defense over here is still extremely weak. First of all, the buffer zone between the line of contact and Huliapole has shrunk in a really significant manner in a very short period of time. Because even if we're going based off of the most extreme gray zone estimates, the Russians are only about 4 or 5 kilometers away from the first houses. And when you're going from the perspective of the Russian positions directly to the northeast of Huliapole, it's only about a kilometer away. And in some cases, when you're looking at these warehouses and farmland, it's even closer to where the Russians are currently present. And so no longer is there this large buffer zone that can be used by Ukrainian soldiers on the ground to set up obstacles or for drones to spot forces before they approach into the city. That's one major loss. The other loss is the fact that the fortifications here, they're thin in certain locations, especially near Zatisha, so the northeastern direction. You have this major gap that's being exploited by Russian DRGs, presumably along this 2.5 kilometer gap. And then also the fact that even in the locations where you do have a lot of structure set up to defend the perimeter, there aren't any forces that are actually holding on to it. The infantry in these locations, they are holding on in basements within Huliapole itself and not necessarily along the outskirts in fortified posts. You have a weak garrison that has not really been reinforced since I last uploaded a video. And that's not surprising when you think about the fact that there aren't any major mobile reserves that can be deployed in a rapid manner to alleviate the situation, because those reserves, if they even exist, they're needed elsewhere. And even when we're talking about moving forces from one front to another, there are other locations that are even higher on the pecking order, Murad being a great example that we'll get to later on in this video. So you're still stuck with the 142nd Mechanized Brigade and the 102nd TDF Brigade. And that's simply not sufficient to hold on to Huliapole once the Russian forces get a foothold in the city itself, which is getting closer and closer as time goes on. Now, at the same time, I'm also aware of some of the maximalist Russian reports of what's been going on further northwards along the Huliapole River line. So there are claims from Russian sources that they've been able to capture essentially everything south of Ustav-Pivske all the way up until Dobropilia. So that would include Nechaivka, Radisny, and Novo-Zaporizhia. And then essentially the front line runs along the Huliapole River and the trench is built to its west. And then all of the hinterlands, all these major open fields, and you're talking about areas that are in high elevation first and foremost, so it is tactically significant. But there are areas that just are completely barren. They lack any fortifications, defensive works. And so it's very easy for the Russian forces to simply bypass these areas, go through there very quickly, and not encounter much resistance. Likewise, for the Ukrainians, it's easier for them to really remain in very small, limited pockets for an extended period of time and try to probe the gray zone. And that's sort of what's been happening directly east of Huliapole for the past week. So, according to the Russian narrative that has developed in recent days, it would imply that this entire area directly to the east of the Huliapole River has fallen into their hands. And it could be true again. I'm not going to dismiss it, but I'm not going to change the map to indicate such a projection without further corroboration. For the time being, what we do know to be true is that the Russian forces have been able to expand control past Donbas, and their focus now is south of the Huliapole River, meaning you have the river over here, and to the north you have Ustapivska, and then from there you can already arrive at areas around Pokrovsk's outskirts, and that's obviously a Russian objective, and we've talked about it ad nauseum actually, but the main priority right now is to take over the entirety of the Huliapole River line, not necessarily because that's going to be used to flank Huliapole from the north, because the Russians are already at the gates of Huliapole from a far closer proximity, but it's more so due to the fact that you have this line, this vertical line that's meant to protect the heartland of Zaporozhye that the Ukrainians still control. That, of course, leads into the eastern flank of the city of Zaporozhye once you go 50 kilometers westwards. So ultimately, that's the Russian goal, to overrun this final organized line of defense that will then open up access to a lot of rear villages, a lot of logistics nodes that are further westwards within what was previously considered to be untouchable territory in Zaporozhye Oblast, in the final quarter of the oblast that the Ukrainians, of course, still retain control over. But getting back to the point, the Russians captured over here 7 square kilometers of territory, advanced southwards from Donbas, and this is a 5-kilometer advance along the river. In this video compilation from November 21st, you can see that they captured Radisna. This is from the 64th Motor Rifle Brigade. they claim to have destroyed, quote unquote, a company's worth of personnel from the 154th Mechanized Brigade, along with 12 units of equipment. So 154th, again, one of the key Ukrainian units involved in the defense along this line. They've consistently been pushed back. And if we were to take, obviously, the reports from Voin at face value each time that a village was lost, then the 154th Brigade wouldn't even exist anymore, because each time they claimed that a company or platoon was destroyed, and then you add it up, and it would be way more than what constitutes a brigade. And so what's likely going on over here is that the definition of a company is being sort of exaggerated, in that when the Russians are talking about destroying a company, first of all, that's not killing them all. It's also wounding some or taking some POW. And moreover, their definition of one is very elastic, and it's probably much smaller than what we would consider a company to be with a NATO standard. In any case, that doesn't really matter. It's neither here nor there. It's more of a pedantic thing that I've noticed. But same thing over here with the Tisha. We had the video from November 24th of the 114th Motor Rifle Regiment, which is part of the 127th Division. They captured it, and they claimed to destroy 2 companies worth of personnel, along with 20 units of equipment. So again, take everything with a grain of salt. But again, the direction in which it's heading, if it has not occurred already, is to continue advancing southwards along the river line towards Zaporizhia, and then from there to Novopavlivka, and with the forces really concentrating all of their efforts on these villages. Naturally, everything to the east will be exposed and will be cut off and squeezed out naturally. And so those locations, those excess fields, will then in the process be taken over. That's the Russian sort of end game right now. And then from there, the focus, so the emphasis will be shifted several kilometers westwards. And we can see that over here, about 13 kilometers westwards at its maximum. And then from there, the front line is concentrated on Priluki, Vuhledar, Zelenet, and the trenches that are protecting the eastern outskirts of all those settlements. Now, looking at Tika, this village has been taken over by the Russians based on video footage from November 23rd of the 36th Motor Rifle Brigade. They captured Tika, and they also claim to destroy a company's worth of Ukrainian personnel, along with 12 units of equipment. So Tika, this village that is located directly south of the Vovchansk River, has been seized, and this is, again, 26.2 square kilometers worth of territory. This is significant because it's a major step forward from Oleksivka, where you had the previous Russian sort of forward operating base. It's an advance of about 5.5 kilometers northwards, and naturally, all of the ravines and the tree lines and farmland located south of Tika was also captured in the process. So it ends up adding up to a pretty large landmass taken up in total. And it has led to a bit of a straightening out of the front line based on the Vovchansk River, because we already know from mid-November that our Huliapole was captured. So that's a bit of a faltering from the Ukrainian perspective, that they're withdrawing from the bridgehead south of the river. So now we're looking out for what's going to happen in Sosnivka and whether the line will correct over there. And then the same thing with the Ukrainians that are present directly south of Kolomitsi. And from there, you already have the Vovchansk River being the new dividing line. That's a problem for the Ukrainians, because they would prefer to have a bridgehead south that would act as a buffer. Having the Vovchansk River as the buffer in and of itself is not sufficient, because it's still relatively narrow, and over a long enough span of the front line, there's naturally eventually going to develop a opening that can be exploited by the Russian forces, and that will permeate into Veliki Kumykhalivka, into Kolomitsi, and then eventually into Pokrovsk, which is really not that far away from where the Russians are currently present. It's only about 7 kilometers away. Yes, the river is there as a dividing line, but we can already see the first sort of signs, inklings of a river crossing being possible that will then converge onto this town. So again, even though that's not the main priority, that direction has to be really kept in check. And the fact that the Ukrainians have not been able to reinforce it, the fact that they are choosing not to because other locations are more important, lends credence to the possibility that the situation will continue to deteriorate, such that eventually it will become a frontline town. Now, that's exactly what happened in Novopavlivka, an area where there was a massive buffer. There was also a river, the Vovchansk River, that acted as a dividing line. And due to a lack of investment, due to the Russians finding weak points that could be rapidly exploited, they were able to cross over a large stretch of territory and then infiltrate into Novopavlivka. And ever since then, which is what we talked about in my last video, the Russians have been able to double down on their presence over here in Novopavlivka and nearly take over the entirety of the town, actually. So they've been able to capture 8.5 square kilometers since my last upload, And at most, they advanced about 3.2 kilometers westwards, perhaps even more over here. Yeah. So there's a couple of videos backing this up. One from November 23rd of the Consolidated Rifle Brigade of the Ukrainian Air Force conducting FPV strikes onto the Russian forces in southern Novopavlivka. So remember this unit, they were operating in Vovchansk, then they were moved to Kupiansk as a reinforcement, and they were moved away from Kupiansk, even though that's a critical section of the front line, to an even more important location, that being Novopavlivka, where they're meant to act as a stabilization force. Now, the Russians also on the 25th crossed over the river, and this was over the Solona River. So the 3rd Battalion of the 46th Air Assault Brigade conducted FPV strikes onto Russian forces as they were infiltrating into the fortifications and houses in the southwestern part of the town. And so this is an area that's a bit more stretched out. There's a lot more coverage when it comes to shrubbery for the Russian infantry, and they've already been able to gain a foothold across the river, meaning the Ukrainians will not be able to drag out the fighting using the river, using the houses, using the fortifications on the western bank. It's simply not feasible because the Russians moved so quickly that now they've been able to establish a bridgehead across the river. And from there, the momentum can't really be reversed. And so the Russians are already implementing this plan to go one by one and clear out all these nodes in western Novopavlivka in order to ensure that the front line doesn't really die down and get bogged down in this particular section. And that's a problem for the Ukrainians, and that's why they've redeployed forces to this area. But it's not been sufficient. As you guys can see over here, northwestern Novopavlivka has also been overrun. There's a video from November 14th, and yeah, it's old by now. It's been 2 weeks and all, but this is from the initial breakthrough by the Russian side. They were able to cross over, and this is from the Prone unit. It's from the 42nd Mechanized Brigade. They conducted FPV strikes onto those Russian infantry as they made it to Vulitsia, Molodizhnya. So now, naturally, the goal for the Russians is to seize the remaining outskirts of the town, and then from there, also all the trenches around its perimeter. That would open up, as I've highlighted numerous times now, a wide open route along a paved road and also just through open fields and heights towards the next line of defenses meant to protect Nezhovo. And you're talking now about a jump of about, about 9 kilometers northwards, and everything in between comes into the line of sight, into the line of fire for the Russian side. And so, again, that has major implications, and it's why the Ukrainians are trying to hold on firmly to the remaining maybe 10% of Novopavlivka that they have solidly under their control, although much of it is occurring in futility. Now, let's turn off the fortification map because it is beginning to lose its usefulness around the Pokrovsk region, as you guys can imagine. And you guys can see over here that the Russian side has been able to shift their focus past Pokrovsk because now almost all of it has been taken over by the Russian side and focus it on Hishni. So over here, we can see that the Russians have captured over the past 9 days nearly 4 square kilometers worth of territory southeast or within southeastern Hishni. And it's an advance of about 3.5 kilometers northwestwards. So let's click on the videos and see what is present over here. The 155th Mechanized Brigade, they conducted FPV strikes onto Russian soldiers as they were approaching from the industrial zone in Bukovka in northwestern Pokrovsk and made their way along the 00525 or through otherwise open fields from dachas or wherever it may be. And they were able to enter the first houses, the first garden cooperatives, the first dachas within southeastern Hishni. That's where they were struck over a 3-day time span by the 155th, but regardless, those strikes indicate to us the presence of Russian soldiers in this area. Now, past that point, on November 27th, the Russian forces were able to further develop their offensive and advance another 1.25 square kilometers northwestwards along, again, the same general route piercing through the main road connecting into the town. So the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, which we already knew was at least partially deployed to this part of the front line, at least one of its companies was over here, but now it appears as if the entire brigade has been moved away from where it was previously stationed, which was generally focused on the sort of Dobropilya direction, Novopavlivka, Ivanivka, even Kucherov Yar, that entire section. And it's been moved southwestwards because, again, the situation is far more critical over here. The situation has sort of died down to the east of Dobropilya, both when it comes to Ukraine's counterattacking capacity and also the Russian willingness to continue pushing forward. The only area where there is still high-intensity combat right now, which would be the Kazanich River line, is a bit further to the east. But that's neither here nor there. Moving southwards, the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, they released footage on November 22nd of the shelling of these Russian soldiers as they were entering into the first houses over here. So Hishni is already contested, and this is at a time where Hishni is still really important to the Ukrainians and is being relied upon as the conduit between the external rear and then everything that the Ukrainians are continuing to sustain within the Murad pocket itself. Now, this gets us to the next topic, which is Murad itself, but let's first look at Pokrovsk. So Putin actually talked about today in his sort of brief on the developments in the war about the fact that Pokrovsk is 70% under control of the Russians. So even based on his official assessment, there are still large sections that could be considered a gray zone. And even my map overestimates the control the Russians have in relation to what he's saying. And I think that, yeah, again, my map is definitely closer and more reflective of reality based on the fact that it's looking at, geolocated proof. But that's not to say that there aren't pockets of Ukrainian resistance that, first of all, may not even be permanently under their control. There could be cases where there are infiltrations by DRGs, even up until this day where we're talking, because the fields north of Pokrovsk are still open and still could be accessed by the Ukrainians. And so it's not too far-fetched to say that there are still maybe some that infiltrate into the northern sections of the town, even though I have them marked as being Russian-held. And even if we disregard that, there is still the Shcherbakovka microdistrict in the dachas within this area, this zone, which has not been fully taken over by the Russians yet by any metric. And so that's still a section of the town or the city of Pokrovsk that we still can indicate is partially under Ukrainian control. We have it marked with this blue color. And then you have another pocket of resistance that I'm aware of, and that would be over here to the southwest of Rivne. You have the industrial zone. You have a large factory over here and a couple of houses, and this is a outstretched pocket that still has not been cleared up by the Russian side. But regardless of that fact, a lot of Russian sources have been talking about the full capture of Pokrovsk, and that is pretty close and pretty much reflective of the reality on the ground. What else has been mentioned? This is something that's far more dubious in terms of the validity or veracity of the claim. They're claiming that they've been able to fully sever connection between the rear, which would be Hishni, and the Murad. They've been able to fully encircle the town. And the map that I've seen shared widely by the Russian sources indicates that the line of contact looks something like this, as in the Russian forces from Rudinsk were able to take over the entirety of the town, at least the southern part of the town, and then from there move southwards along the paved road, the vertical paved road that sort of bisects the Pokrovsk Murad accumulation, and then from there rendezvous with Russian forces coming from the south, branching out from the northeastern outskirts of Pokrovsk, and then sort of meeting up around here near this intersection. And then from there are claims that they've been able to push westwards towards some of these farming warehouses. So that's generally been mentioned by a lot of Russian sources. What is true, and this is what we can verify at a bare minimum, is that the Russians advanced 1.1, not 1.1, but they were able to capture a piece of territory that amounts to 1.1 square kilometers. The advance was about 1.7 kilometers northwards. There's a video here from the 3rd Battalion of the 25th Airborne Assault Brigade, and they dropped grenades onto Russian soldiers within the Zaporozhye farm. That's the name of this dacha cooperative. So that much is true, that there is a Russian presence over here, and so it's not that much of a stretch to say that since then DRGs could have approached this warehouse a kilometer away or this one 1.8 kilometers away, and also try to link up with Russian forces 4 kilometers away in Rudinsk. But for this to be verified, completely verified, within the standards that I'm using for the sort of indications of where the line of contact is, we'd have to see proof of an advance within southern Rudinsk and then some sort of presence of Russian forces along the highway near this forest or near windbreaks, near the warehouses, and that would obviously instill confidence as to whether these claims are true or not. But regardless of whether there is actually a physical encirclement, it is absolutely true that the situation has even further deteriorated when it comes to the supplies coming in and out of Murad. And I do think that, yes, the garrison has diminished by a pretty large amount since my last video. And that means that while there were withdrawals, we have not seen any sort of mass surrender incident except for the one that we talked about in the last video of those, I think, 25 individuals, give or take, from the 25th Brigade that surrendered. But besides that, you're not looking at any sort of mass surrenders in this area. The mass movements by forces are not actually in the direction of surrendering, they're in the direction of retreat. And that happens now and has continued to happen for weeks on end. And that's where you see most of the casualties unfolding because Ukrainian soldiers go out in the open. And that's when they're exposed to drone covered by the Russians and are naturally picked off. And so that's the main sort of way in which the garrison in Murad is diminishing on a daily basis. It's through those casualties during attempted withdrawals. Moreover, we look at Rivne. This is an area that still is largely under the control of the Ukrainians, but to the south, you have 50 hectares of territory taken over by the Russians. A video here from November 20th indicating that reinforcements were moved into the pocket. The 35th Marine Brigade was redirected from Novopavlivka, and now it's been attached to the 7th Rapid Response Corps. And they conducted FPV strikes onto houses in Rivne. So this is an advance of, let's see, about 900 meters eastwards. Again, I'm aware of the depiction of the situation by a lot of Russian sources indicates that they've been able to push far deeper along the T-0504 with the intention of just severing Murad into two based off of the T-0504. And that goes hand in hand with reporting that the northeastern sections of Murad have already fallen into Russian hands. Again, something that is not verified yet, although there is certainly a push coming from the eastern and northern directions over here. What we do know is that the Russians are making some significant inroads south of Murad, and so they captured at least 5.3 square kilometers over here in the Lysivka-Sukhyar area. All of Lysivka has been taken over by the Russians, and Sukhyar remains pretty much a gray zone, although the Russians are in the process of clearing it out entirely. The Ukrainians have withdrawn, for the most part, into the southern parts of Murad, and I'm aware of some claims that this section of southern Murad has fully been taken over by the Russians, and that the front line is essentially running along this rail track and also around the northern edge of the southern district of Murad. That all could be true because we have not seen any proof of Ukrainian forces on the ground over here for days on end now. But on the flip side, we have not seen any proof of Russian advancements since my last video over in this location, where we saw the proof of the Russian forces near Vulitsia Sierova or Vulitsia Strutenska or along mine 5/6. But in terms of actual presence in houses further west, we just haven't seen much of that yet. The garrison in Murad has not been significantly reinforced, but there have been some additional supplementary forces moved in either to rotate others out or to hold a line near the flanks and supply routes. So this is where you have the 38th Marine Brigade, you have the 35th in particular, the 1st, 2nd, and 137th Marine Battalions of the unit are present over here. You have a lot of the 79th Air Assault Brigade up until now, and also the 25th. And I'll click on a couple of other units that I see are present over here, like the 503rd of the 38th Marine Brigade, 2nd National Guard Brigade, and then the 68th Jaeger Brigade and its drone units. So that's pretty much the order of battle with the Murad. And then in Rodinska, we can see that the northern edge is continuing to fall deeper and deeper into Russia's grasp. So another 0.6 square kilometers of an advance over here. And we can see over here the Typhoon drone company of the National Guard conducted FPV strikes onto those same Russian soldiers as they were advancing into northern Rodinska. So clearly there has been a bit of a shift over here because the Russians have been able to overcome the gray zone and finally step into these houses over here in northern Rodinska, something that hitherto this point was not really feasible. And now the next step is to simply push the Ukrainians out of the western edges of the town and fully secure the perimeter. But now moving on, let's look at what's going on within the Kazany-Taras River line. So the Russians have been able to advance and really close a lot of excess Ukrainian pockets based around very flimsily controlled tree lines or ravines or such. So this is about 5 square kilometers of territory captured in an advance, if we're measuring it, of about 1.8 kilometers northwards. So in the process, certain portions of Kurakhove were taken over by the Russian side, but not entirely. There still is this final remaining pockets in the eastern section of Kurakhove that is now enveloped from the east, west, and south by Russian presence and pressure. But nonetheless, it is a location where there is still Ukrainian presence because the flip side will be losing it and then giving the Russians this forward operating base to move several kilometers northwards. It's not a non-trivial amount of space to advance through. It's about 3 kilometers northwards, and that's when you arrive at Turets and Sofivka. those being, again, two really heavily fortified, well-defended towns that open up access along that same road towards Druskivka and more generally towards Kramatorsk. But again, that's something that we have to analyze in far more detail in the future. Over here to the southeast of Sofivka, about 2.75 square kilometers was taken over, and it's an advance of about 1.4 kilometers to the northwest. Let's look at what's going on to the east now. I want to zoom in for a bit on Ivanopilia because, for the most part, it's been taken over by the Russian side. We can click over here on the geolocations that back this up. First of all, November 21st, the 1,194th, 78th Motor Rifle Regiments, along with the 4th Motor Rifle Brigade, they captured Ivanopilia. This is from November 1st. This is what they were claiming, but as we'll soon find out, that's not entirely true. Either way, 1.4 square kilometers of territory was captured, and we have this video here doubling down on the indication that the Russians are present in this town, showing grenade drops onto Russian soldiers as they were trying to cross over the Kryvyi River and presumably gain a foothold near the sort of western edge of the riverbank over here. And again, this is all with the intention of then circling back down southwards and clearing the Ukrainians out of their presence in Ploshivka. And that will be done and applied through the western flank. We can see over here that there still remains some pockets of resistance, and perhaps not even resistance, but simply just a gray zone and a lack of entry into some of these houses in the southern part of Ivanopilia. But let's move on to what's going on northwards in Siversk, because this is an area where we have three major updates. First of all of Svanivka has been taken over by the Russian side. Svanivka accounts for 1.85 square kilometers worth of territory, and it's an advance northwards of about 2.3 kilometers northwards. There are three videos over here backing up the claims that this town Svanivka has been taken over. Here we can see on November 23rd, the 88th Motor Rifle Brigade, they are really important when it comes to the composition of the order of battle in this region. So they stormed the houses in western Svanivka. Over here, the northern edge, the Archon unit of the 108th Mountain Assault Battalion connected FPV strikes onto this location in northern Svanivka. And the 88th Motor Rifle Brigade also cleared out houses in the northern edge of Svanivka on November 22nd. So you're looking, again, at an advance of, let's see how much it accounts for vertically, over 2 kilometers of advance northwards to Svanivka, which is a moderately sized town in comparison to many of these other hamlets, and slightly more concentrated in terms of its sort of density. But in any case, what this means is that now there is a fresh and rather large base of operations for the Russian side to continue expanding their operations. And the distance between the line of contact that the Russians have been able to set for themselves between their own forces and Svanivka is only about 1.3 kilometers. So the situation does nonetheless remain extremely flimsy for whatever forces are still present over here, if there even are ones, because perhaps by now this area is, even though it's nominally under Ukrainian control, perhaps in reality, it's largely been abandoned by the Ukrainians due to its exposed nature, and then the vacuum is filled by the Russian end. I don't know if that's true or not, but for now, I'm going to err on the side of caution and say that there's still a possibility of a Ukrainian presence, even though, look at it, it's an advance of about, or a movement of about 7 kilometers southwards to go from the bottom-like portion of the pocket all the way southwards to its end. In Siversk itself, this is an advance of about 1.5 square kilometers, and it's an advance 1.4 kilometers westwards. So Siversk itself is currently under assault from the south. This is where you have had already extremely deep infiltrations, and at the same time, we're now beginning to see the manifestation of assaults coming in from the east. So the northeastern district is contested now based on this video of the 1st Battalion of the 54th Mechanized Brigade dropping grenades onto houses in that exact same location in northeastern Siversk. There's also the implication by a lot of Russian sources that this excess open field territory and some tree lines simply are no longer under Ukrainian control because the Ukrainians don't have the logistical bandwidth to cross over the Bakhmutovka River without being struck, and then also to disperse first forces and resources to the Ukrainians on either end of the rail line, whether it be the west or the east. And on the east, it's already a full bonified battlefield. And so that's pretty much it when it comes to the Siversk region. The goal now for the Russians is to clear out this excess territory and open fields to the east of Siversk, and then to just close in on the eastern perimeter and do so with support from the flanks north and south. Now, let's move on to what's going on in Platonivka. This is an advance of about 2 square kilometers, and it's a movement southwestwards from Dronivka Donivka, of course, being taken over by the Russian side in recent weeks, and that could definitely be used as a base of operations to move southwards and flank Siversk from the north. That's not the only objective that could be accrued or could be actualized based on the capture of Donivka and various other targets that are running along the southern bank of the Donets River, because Siversk is already within peril due to its proximity to the northern, eastern, and southern flanks that are closing in on it. But the capture of Platonivka is even more important because it could be used to sever the road connection between Slavyansk, or between the northern end of the Donets River, and then whatever forces are currently being replenished from Siversk. So not only is that important, but there's also the possibility of moving southwards continually, getting control over these important ridges, and then from there, dominating control over this chain of villages that runs more or less horizontally from Svyato Pokrovsk to Ruznikivka. So those areas would be on the docket, of course. Looking at Yampil, for the most part, it's been taken over by the Russians. Maybe I'll save myself some time and mark it as red within this video itself. And this is an advance southwestwards of about 3.6 kilometers. And we can see that the extent of the advance amounts to 4.3 square kilometers. So Yampil is slightly larger than many of the other hamlets in this region. And there was a pretty significant back and forth between Ukrainian special forces and the Russians within this town. But eventually, the Russians were able to overwhelm the Ukrainians just due to the sheer brute force that allowed them to advance directly through the town itself. We're not even talking about a flanking maneuver over here. And what this means is that a lot of the excess forests or floodplains, whatever it may be, just these geographic features that are on either end of the rivers, they're going to, of course, be difficult to clear out and overrun. So these are locations that still I have marked as under Ukrainian control, simply because the Russians have not even attempted to go in yet and clear out these particular areas out. But at the same time, they are still looking into the future. And so we can see over here that the Russians are already making these plays to push extremely westwards to in a manner that we can measure over here. We can quantify. It's a movement of about like 10 plus kilometers away from what the normal mean would be, given the fact that there is currently a contest in Torska. But in any case, the advance over here amounts to 1.3 square kilometers worth of territory. It's an advance of, let's see, 1.4 kilometers westwards, and we have videos to back it up. So here there is from November 19th, the 120th Territorial Defense Brigade dropping or connecting FPV strikes onto houses in the Komunalny microdistrict, which I would suppose, I didn't check on a Ukrainian Google Maps iteration, but we can see over here that that microdistrict is likely the one that is placed in the southeastern section of Mirhorod, whereas these dachas over here to the east of Lyman, they're not even necessarily connected to the boundaries of Lyman itself, but this is the Maslia Kivkamat neighborhood, which is largely fallen into, in this case, Russian hands. So that's pretty much it when it comes to Lyman. You can see that the northwestern flank of Lyman is currently in the process of being taken over. So Novopavlivka taken over by the Russian side. This is about 2.6 square kilometers worth of territory, and it's an advance southwards of about 1.8 kilometers. So Novopavlivka is contested. The southern outskirts are really the deciding factor between the categorization of the town one way or another. And you can see how it can be used as a key to advance along, in this case, Vulitsia Zlobozhanska. And from there, arrive at Drobysheve and all the other towns and other networks or other fortified posts, and organize just the northwest of Lyman and take advantage of that flank that is not necessarily the most protected. As you guys can see, between the trenches that sort of extend out of Stavki, and then the ones that are sort of running over here, you can see that there is still this massive gap in between Drobysheve, the entrance to Drobysheve, and the road network that it passes through, and then the Siversk Donets River and all of the forests nearby. It's not an extremely significant distance. It's about 6 kilometers in width. But in any case, this is a location that definitely can be used as exploitation to put pressure on the northwestern flank of Lyman, although for now that's not happened. But I have to say that we did project over here during the summer that eventually we'd see these DRGs infiltrating through the forest into southeastern Lyman, and that's what we're seeing as we're speaking at this very moment. A couple of final words and final updates, and hopefully this sort of cursory update was worth it, even though it is very long. We can see that for the most part, Vuhledar has been taken over by the Russian side, and they've been able to advance, in this case, the Russians, in two directions. One westwards towards Novopavlivka, and that's a push of about 3.25 kilometers to the west. Moreover, you have the infiltration by the Russians over here, the polygon 209. I'm just going to call it Russia Kharkiv for this case. And you can see how they were able to advance northwestwards into the southern parts of Vuhledar. It's an advance of about 3 kilometers northwestwards. And there's a video to back it up from November 22nd from the 77th Air Mobile Brigade. They conducted FPV strikes and grenade drops onto a Russian assault group. I think it consisted of 9 men. And they were able to get into the first houses and dugouts within Vuhledar. Since then, it's presumed that they've been able to retain control and build up a stronger base. And so now the question is whether they'll be able to use that as a necessary linchpin to push up northwards and take over the entirety of the town, because that would precipitate the collapse of the entire mini pocket that is formed over here from Zakhrijove to Novopavlivka and all of the other open fields and trenches that are located in between. And then the line would just sort of falter or correct itself along the Oskil River itself. And now a similar move is being directed onto Novopavlivka due to the recent advances to the west of Siversk and Kreminna. And the goal is to advance through these narrow corridors, through obstacles and geographic features, and then to cut off the P-79 to reach the river from the eastern bank, and then to move attention southwards and begin flanking Borova in this case, because, again, Borova is one of the largest Ukrainian strongholds on the eastern edge of the Oskil River. Now, let's just finish off by seeing what's going on in the Vovchansk region, because there are a couple of updates from here. So let's just begin with the city of Vovchansk itself. There's a video from 16th Army Corps, and it shows FPV strikes onto southern Vovchansk on November 27th. It's an advance over here that amounts to 14 hectares, but regardless, it is near a gas station and it's a couple of high rises. So you can just see how these final outskirts, southern outskirts, are now being systematically cleared and cleansed by the Russian side. Now, the one area where this is not manifested yet is in the southeastern corner of the town, where you do have a lot of these outstretched locations and just private one-story residential areas and gardens and shrubbery and such. So that's a location that the Russians still have to clear out before claiming that the entirety of Vovchansk has been seized by the Russian side. Now, over here, Selydove and Lyman have either been taken over completely or contested. So you can see over here that this advance amounts to 2.5 square kilometers of attack, and southwards it amounts to 2.7 kilometers. So there's a video here from this is from November 25th. The 1st Battalion of the 58th Motorized Brigade conducted FPV strikes onto Russian infantry and trenches and houses within Lyman and Selydove. Here is the 58th. And I don't know if I have the 1st Battalion marked over here. I have a couple of other battalions from the unit that are scattered around here, but I don't know about, of course, the first one. In any case, though, this does indicate the Ukrainians had really good reasons for putting all their eggs into the one basket, that being Vovchansk, because now that we've seen that there is a route and a willingness and a capability to bypass it from the west through the forest, and then actually develop a continued offensive southwards that does sort of lend credence to the offensive potential in this area, which is actually sort of immense, because you don't have that many major trench fortifications or major connected lines of defense that can be used to drag out the fighting across a broad sector. And so that means that many of these pinpointed advances are receiving far more success and fruits of their labor than they would have been able to materialize or actualize otherwise, when you look at the context for the pace of the advances in this particular case. But that's really it for today. Thank you all for watching. If it wasn't obvious, I'm tired, but I took 3 hours to just go through and compile all the news that I've been able to ignore for the past week and a couple of days. But now that's changing. I do want to upload more frequently, and I know it's basically become trite by now to say that, because I've said it so many times. But definitely, there's no way to do worse than not uploading for 9 days. So you can expect improvements. But again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.